Communities and Schools organization up in Greenwood received quite a bit of money from Communities and Schools National to do programming down here on the coast. A lot of it they gave away as cash to schools and such, but they also wanted to bring in writers and artists and theater people to work with the community as kind of a healing process, to use the arts as a way of getting through the aftermath of the storm. And I came down here to conduct creative writing workshops. First place I went was the hospital. One of the writers in our program, Bev Blasingame, had a daughter who was a nurse there. And that was the first, it was Bev who told me about the need to do something over there. So I went to the hospital first, and then came over to the senior center and fire station. And I really started all the workshops at the same time. I spent about a week just meeting people and kind of getting the lay of the land and figuring out where this could happen and where not. And somebody say, oh, you've got to talk to the firemen. They've got the best stories. Or, oh, you've got to go over to the senior center. Those folks have, lots to tell. So a lot of it is just that sort of investigative detective work. People sort of send you to whatever community venue they think is going to, I think, has the most dramatic stories. The fire station, the police station were places where, they thought there'd be a lot of drama. And I did enjoy those workshops. There's a lot of drama at the hospital, a lot of drama here at the senior center as well. It was 5 weeks. I was down here for 5 weeks, and I was living here. And it was a really sort of intense emotional time for me because there wasn't a lot of infrastructure in place. I'm not a cell phone person. The first thing I did was I bought a cell phone because that's the only way that you could do business down here. Most of the folks I was working with were in FEMA trailers and such. Everybody's situation and circumstance was under great duress. Just living in this environment was a sort of stressful experience back then. And we were back during the next year's hurricane season, so that added a whole other level of tension as well. So setting it all up was kind of interesting and intense. But then once we began the writing process and people realized that they didn't have to just take the entirety of their experience, their being, their engagement with Katrina and condense it into a brief story, that they could just kind of pick around the edges, if you will, find those little scenes and vignettes, then some really neat stuff started coming out. And I think the best thing that came out of it was the book. There's something about the process was great, but having a product and everybody sharing the stories, the publication of the book seemed to have a real cathartic effect on the community. The books just disappeared quickly. There was an enormous buzz in the community. We gave them away free. It created just reading one another's stories, and strangers would say, oh, I read your story and such. And it seemed to give the whole community a kind of handle on the storm, which was great. When I worked with the folks in the community, the one thing I didn't want was everybody writing exactly the same story about the storm. So we went for some sort of really unique little vantage point, a unique memory that they had, which might be a little bit offbeat. Some of the work is humorous, some of it is very surrealistic. I would say, the strangest moment that you can recall or the most vivid moment that you can recall. So each story evolved out of a separate moment, time and space. And the storm was so huge and it affected people over such a span of time that it was relatively easy when you took that approach that all of the stories would be sort of unique. It's kind of like the blind man and the elephant. With all of the different stories, you then begin to get a sense of the storm. So when the book came out, it's what good creative writing does, which is not, oh, I had that exact same experience, but it's where you read a story that resonates with you because it evokes a moment in time which is in some senses universal, or you can feel it, or it echoes something that you've experienced yourself. And then I just wanted them to make it as real as they possibly could, and just narrow it down. Don't make it huge and big, but just narrow it down into these unique moments in space and time. And they did a great job. Well, Audrey, she came in and she said, "My daddy wanted me to be a writer. He always said that. Now I'm 80 years old, and she's churned out a lot of stuff." Well, Richard was writing before Darlene's turned into quite a writer, but they all did really well. I liked even the young kids, the stories they did in the Summer Scholars Program. It was great. I started as a poet in the schools back in 1979. That sort of Kenneth Koch-driven program in New York. The National Endowment for the Arts provided money around the country to the state's arts commissions to run community-based arts programs in the schools, artists in the schools. And I started as a poet, an artist in the schools program back in '79. It depends on the setting. You know, every community. I wrote a monograph back in '96 for Americans for the Arts called "Artists in the Community: Training Artists to Work in Alternative Settings." And in that book, I focused on schools, prisons, housing developments, hospitals and hospices, parks and rec facilities, and there was another one there. I can't remember it right off the bat. But every venue that you go into has its own sort of issues and culture and such. And so you try to work with that community culture. The fire station, here, the nice thing about Pascagoula, I worked at the fire station, I worked at the hospital, I worked in a school setting, and I worked at a senior center. And each venue had its own gods, so to speak. You know, it's at the fire station, if the bell went off, workshop was over. They're all getting on the truck and heading out. You know, at the hospital, it was kind of the same. You know, if there needed to be an intervention of some type, people would kind of flow in and out of the workshops, and because it's a 7-day-a-week, 24-hour operation as well. Senior center, people do come to remember, and so you got a kind of different savoriness about the workshops over here. So each venue had its own sort of attributes that I tried to work with. Oddly enough, I think the firemen were the most shy about their work. What I tell the writers is that we talk, we share, we correspond with one another, we work with one another, but when we really truly try to communicate feeling, emotion, experience to someone else, we turn to painting, to creative writing, to poetry, to dance, music. I mean, it is through the arts that we try hardest to convey what our experiences are like to another human being and make sure that they get it. And there was just so much to communicate after Katrina. Even though everybody was here together, there was still a feeling of loneliness and isolation. Everybody had lost so much that they were afraid to talk to one another about it because their losses would then be perceived as greater than others' losses. And so people just kept a lot in. And the creative writing workshops afforded folks the opportunity to just sort of let it out. When I first started working in the prison system, Texas prison system back in '81, I was sort of motivated by the Dostoevsky quote that you know your society through its prisons. As a writer, I was going to get a vantage and an interesting perspective on life that other writers would not have. And I've worked in prisons all over the U.S. and Europe and South America. So arts and corrections is kind of a specific area of professional development for me. But coming here, I am a son of Mississippi. I was born in Brookhaven. I have a niece in Poplarville who lost her house, sister in Hattiesburg who was without power and electricity for a long time. I went to high school in New Orleans. So I think after the storm, I felt compelled to do something. And I was just really grateful that communities and schools gave me the opportunity to come down and do this writing project. I did my part, but it was as much for me as it was for the. I mean, I knew how big it was, and I knew how disastrous the whole circumstance was, and I needed to contribute something. And it was really nice that through the creative writing, I could contribute something meaningful. That made me, it was real affirming for me, but it was also a very emotional experience for me to be down here and do this as well. I just learned a lot while I was down here working with these folks, and I appreciate it takes a lot of courage to open up and share your stories with others. And I just commend these folks for their courage to take on the task of writing about such an experience.